All right, guys, we're going to go ahead and get started. I really appreciate that you all coming here. This is especially exciting for me. This is our sixth annual Water Lecture Series program. It's a program that we developed the law school in conjunction with a couple of the units on main campus, the water management program, Texas Water Resources Institute, and so on. And it's a program that we've grown over the years into I think a bigger event in the sense of the folks that we bring here, the caliber of the speakers and so on, and the notoriety that we get for it. So we're really excited for this opportunity. I'm especially excited because occasionally, this is a collaboration with these other units. We have to agree on who we're going to bring in. But this year, they not only were we able to bring in who I think are sort of the highest caliber folks we've ever had, but they also happen to be good friends of mine. We're going to have Dr. Francesco Sindico, who is a professor at the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow. He also directs their graduate natural resources environmental law program at the law school. And I also have the honor of being co-counsel with Dr. Sindico on a case in front of the International Court of Justice. And so this is something that we're both excited about. And it deals with transboundary water issues, which is really very fitting. We also have Ambassador Aviram from Israel. He was Ambassador of Israel to Greece. He was also on the staff, Chief of Staff for Shimon Peres, who was the Prime Minister and later the President of Israel. He was also one of the chief negotiators between Israel and the Palestinians, Israel and Jordan, the peace treaty with Jordan, specifically on water issues. And so this is a real delight for me to have both of these folks come out here today and participate in this program. So the way we're going to run it is we're going to give them about 20 minutes apiece, and then we're going to have a nice discussion, conversation. We're trying to put them on the spot. You guys are obviously definitely welcome to join in the conversation and ask your questions and so on. So start off with Professor Sindico.
Okay, so probably you don't really need this, but for whoever's watching, hopefully nobody. No, I would really like to thank Gabriel first and foremost. It's a real delight to see all of you here. Gabriel and I go back quite some time now, both in professional terms, but also, I would say, as happens with very good colleagues, also in friendship terms. So it's a real pleasure and an honor to be here with you today. So, Gabriel said a few things. I'm the co-director of the Strathclyde Centre for Environmental Law and Governance. Water law and transboundary water law is just one of the many areas that we deal with there. And transboundary water law has been something I have been looking for a good decade or so. I will say a few things about the areas that I focus a lot, and mainly it's Latin America and Central America. But I will get into that. And what I want to do today is really take you through not so much surface water, but groundwater and transboundary aquifers, and looking at it through the international law lens. I hope to excite you a little bit about it, because our second speaker may just put you down on the legal side. So I'll try to do my best to at least encourage you a little bit to look at the international legal dimension of transboundary aquifers. So what I want to do is just to give you a little bit of context. In such a room, I don't really need to go too much in depth, but why are we even talking about this? So I do want to give you a little bit of context about water, groundwater, and global water security. We will then move and discuss together international law guidelines. And I highlight the word guidelines deliberately, and we'll see why in just a second. And then I'll use this most recent case study, literally a month ago. A memorandum of understanding has been signed on the Ocotopeque-Citalá in Central America. It's between Honduras and El Salvador. And then I'll just conclude by really highlighting that we are in front of a vicious circle of science, policy, and law. I'll just make that as my last point, and I'll give them the floor to Val. If we're talking about water, what are we talking about here? Seriously, we're talking about life. If you want to be alive, you need water. There's no way around it. There's an emerging debate on whether access to water should be a human right. If we have human rights lawyers here, or just law students, there's a key question: what does even a human right even mean? But actually, in many parts of the world, there's an emerging discourse on the normative aspects of human rights. Even in Scotland, where I live now, there's a really strong debate on this human right and human right to access to water. So when we're thinking of water, we're thinking of something that cannot be replaced. It's absolutely essential. And water is in trouble. There's less of it. It's polluted. Some of the usual suspects are clear and in front of us. Climate change being one of them. A huge problem with water in terms of quantity, and in terms of drought, desertification, you name it. But then something that often when you talk at the global level we forget about: increased population. A huge elephant in the room. We're going to go for huge amounts of population in the next 20, 30 years. And obviously everybody will need, if not the same amount of water, even more water. And obviously any kind of socio-economic activity that requires water, be it that agriculture, be it that mining, over lunch we were discussing also shale gas, for example, or extractive industries, they all need water. So what we are in a situation now is that in most parts of the world, not all of them, but in most parts of the world, the attention has always been focused on surface water. But the more water stress there will be around the world, and the more we will start to dig. And we'll look at groundwater. Now again, this is no news for most people in the room, but when I started looking at this, I was very naive, and I thought, well, surface water, groundwater, come on. It'll be more or less the same quantity, Actually, the situation is very different. This in front of you is the amount of surface water available surface water, available fresh water stored in lakes, rivers, wetlands. Compared to these little circles, this is the amount of groundwater. 97% of available freshwater resources are stored underground. So even just that should make it very clear that we are in front of a very clear issue of global water security. And groundwater has a huge role to play. Now, if that's not complicated enough, let's add a further layer of complexity when we're talking about aquifers. And again, law school students here and colleagues in the law environment will know about this, but if we're talking about aquifers, we're talking about two things. We're not just talking about the liquid, the groundwater contained in the rock, we're also talking about the rock. When I have non-hydrology or hydrogeological students in front of me and I try to explain it to them, I try to use the example of a sponge, and the groundwater being the water within the sponge. Let's make things even more complex. If all of these aquifers were just under one country, well, let's leave it to those countries, and international lawyers like me would go and have a pint. That's not the case. We have 592 transboundary aquifers in the world. That is almost 600. Only if you're an island and you're an independent state, you probably don't have a transboundary aquifer. And that may well change in Scotland. So, what are these guidelines? Are there any guidelines that tell two states who share a transboundary aquifer how to move about when it comes to the management? Are there any examples out there? There are very, very few examples. Remember, 592 transboundary aquifers. Maybe Gabriel and I can disagree on the exact number, but roughly, this is what we have. We have the Genovese aquifer. This is between France and Switzerland. We have Northwestern Sahara aquifer system, Nubian and Euromedian. These are the three ones in Africa. We have the Guarani aquifer system in Latin America, which is one of the ones that I've been working on and following for the last 10 years. And the Dizi aquifer between Jordan and Saudi Arabia. And that's it when it comes to, let's say, more formal bilateral intergovernmental agreements. So there's not really much to look at. What do they say? Do they say anything interesting from a legal, content, normative perspective? very little. There's very rudimentary provisions which say the following things mainly. You should exchange information. If you don't know what you're managing, how in the earth can you manage it? A lot of times law ends up being a lot of common sense, if you think about it. Exchange that information. And possibly develop joint authorities to exchange that information and to build management practices based on that information. In very, very few cases, you have clear examples of what to do and what not to do. Regulation, prohibition, for example. One of them is the easy example. But to be honest, out of 592 transboundary aquifers, only 6 have an agreement of some sort, and they're very little content. So where do we go? Is there anything at a global level? Is there anything within the family, say, of the United Nations that can help? Well, we do have a little bit. And this is what you have. So you have the International Law Commission draft articles on the law of transboundary aquifers. And if you want to know more about the process, you have here, Gabriel. This has been annexed to the United Nations General Assembly Resolution 63/124. Now, I highlighted that not because I'm a legal geek or anything, which I hope you will not take away from this lecture or chat. It's because we need to understand what's the legal nature of these guidelines. A General Assembly resolution is non-legally binding. It can be very powerful. There's a lot of legitimacy. Every single country of the world has one vote, be it the United States of America or Switzerland or Namibia or whoever. And this has been adopted by consensus. So it does have weight, but it is not legally binding. And there is an aspect which we don't have time to go into debate now, we can maybe in the Q&A, which is the relationship with another legal instrument, the United Nations Watercourses Convention, which very much provides the normative framework for transboundary surface water, for international watercourses, that in some cases does include transboundary aquifers, hence the overlap and the need to better understand the relationship. The second bullet point points to something that you would say, now wait a second, why is Francesco putting Economic Commission for Europe out there? Okay, we understand he flew from Europe, he may like the EU, he may be sad about Brexit, but why on the earth is he putting it? The point is, this United Nations Economic Commission for Europe actually starts in Alaska and finishes in Kazakhstan. So the name Europe is quite straight in a way. And this water convention, which does include transboundary aquifers, is not only legally binding, but it actually opened itself to any UN member. So at least in principle, this could go global. And there are the UNEC model provisions on transboundary groundwater, which provide some really interesting normative content when it comes to transboundary aquifers. So, what is this normative content? What does it even tell us? So, there's not too much, again, but there's a little bit more, I would say, than in the few agreements that we have seen before. So we have the provision of equitable and reasonable utilization. Beautiful words. Equitable, reasonable. Who in this room would not agree that we have to share in an equitable and reasonable way a natural resource? But then I'll start asking you, what is equitable? Then you, what is equitable? Then you. And we'll all have different answers. So there's a lot of frustration when it actually has to implement this equitable and reasonable utilization. But the truth is that no river and no aquifer are the same. They are in different countries, there are different geopolitical contexts, there are different natural contexts, there are different levels of poverty, there's different everything. So actually, what you think may be a problem, not having a clear definition of equitable and reasonable utilization, is actually its strength. Because it will depend by a number of factors, and these are all listed in the draft articles, and they're very much built on the Watercourses Convention, that have to be taken into account together. So a proportionality test, very much. Now, you have the no harm rule. for those of you who have done either public international law or even environmental law at an international level, you will know that the no harm rule is customary international law, which is that very dangerous concept that freaks out both teachers and students, because then we have to explain what it is, and it's complicated. But it's actually really relevant. And once you actually start doing international law in practice, it becomes the bread and butter of everyday practitioner's life in international law. So the no harm rule is included, and it's very prevalent. You also have a very debated provision on sovereignty, Article 3 of the draft articles, which has been interpreted in many ways. You can go into it in the Q&A if you want. I don't want to spend time on it now. Procedural obligations, what actually makes the things work is procedural obligations, exchange of information, prior notification, environmental impact assessment. All of them in one way or another are present as normative content of the draft article. And what the draft article have, which is different from the work that was mentioned, it has this attention for the aquifer-specific nature. So there are provisions of management of recharge and discharge zones. Take aside the content, what is the legal nature? And this is soft law and not crystallized into custom international law. Depending on where you stand in the hard law versus soft law debate, this is a disaster. How can we even have soft law? It has to be a treaty. We have to go through. If you actually think, well, soft law is not such a bad thing and it allows political will to permeate and to build, then soft law is not such a bad thing. Again, we can discuss later. So now, these are the very few cases around the world, very little guidance at international law level, and soft. Is there anything that has happened recently? And I'm happy to say that in the last month we have something more. We have a memorandum of understanding in the Ocotopeque-Citalá. Where is the Ocotopeque-Citalá? The Ocotopeque-Citalá is between El Salvador and Honduras. It's in Central America, in the region of the Trifinio, which is shared by Guatemala, parts of Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. It's not an official result, but the memorandum stems from an international project called GRETA, Groundwater Governance Resources and Transboundary Aquifers, funded by Swiss Development Corporation and implemented by UNESCO International Hydrological Program. So, I'll keep it short, and again, I'm happy to expand later. An interesting point here is that when they started the project, they thought there was only one aquifer that was shared by Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. The moment they started drilling, the moment they started actually spending some money on the hard science, kicking the lawyers out of the room, they realized, you know, we actually have two aquifers, not one. And only one is transboundary between El Salvador and Honduras, the Ocotopeque-Citalá. So once that happened, then political will and transboundary aquifer awareness started to come in through the project, I have to say, and I was involved in the capacity building element of this project. And this started to develop some interest in actually managing what they didn't even know they had, or at least they didn't know in such detail. Now what is, again, just very briefly, the content and the nature of this memorandum of understanding? Well, the content, again, is very, in a way, simple, but actually is quite interesting. It encourages to identify further data and information about the aquifer and to exchange this information. But it doesn't stop to that. It actually encourages the development of a bilateral management committee. Now, other agreements mention that there should be a commission, for example, in the Guarani Aquifer Agreement, but they don't say what this commission should or should not do, or could not do. The Memorandum of Understanding does say a little bit about what this commission could do. Now, it does refer to the international guidelines, the draft articles, so you start seeing some practice in the sense there's reference back to the draft articles in all these new, very few Memorandum of Understanding for documents. Now the nature, this is even softer than soft law, to be honest. I mean, it was told to me this is a moral commitment. This is just a letter of intention. It's something that wasn't there before. Interesting. I think this is one of the most interesting, but also more complex aspects. This is not between ministers. This is not a treaty. This is not just between municipalities on one side of the border and the other, as you have in Salto Concordia between Argentina and Uruguay. This is a bit of everything. This document was signed by municipalities, by the ministers of environment, by the regional organization called Transboundary. And in the final section, it also opens the door to the possibility that private actors sign this memorandum of understanding. And I'm still thinking my way around whether this is good, bad, or both. So this just gives you a little bit of food for thought based on the most recent case of some sort of agreement between not just countries but a much wider plethora of actors on a transboundary aquifer. 592, only 6, and a few more. So in this Itala, what you see is there was lack of science. There's more science now. The science actually tells us there's only one aquifer that is transboundary. That spurs interest from the politicians, from the politics side. It then leads to a soft law instrument. It could all stay there, dead letter. Nothing happens unless politics kicks in again, and there actually is political will to implement the treaty, or well, this is not a treaty, the memorandum of understanding. And this is very much the message that I will conclude with. This vicious circle, this cycle that in a way never finishes. But let me just get to it, and I just need 1 more minute. Countries, whether we like it or not, will focus more on groundwater. There's less surface water, it's more polluted, and there's just concerns about surface water. So more and more countries will look at groundwater. It is in the country's long-term interest to cooperate with neighboring countries. However, this longer-term interest can clash with short-term political cycles and political gain. But what we have here is complexity. If this were simple, you would not have any problems. It's a bit like climate change. It's a bit like many other problems. These are complex things. They cannot be, and they should not be simplified and trivialized. The complexity of the science and of the management requires long-term solutions underpinned by general accepted normative framework. Tomorrow, as you know, Ram and I will go to the bigger campus. And I will actually want to start with these conclusions and expand more on that. But I'm happy to obviously answer questions in the Q&A. And what we have here, just the last slide, is science needs a long-term strategy. I mean, to understand something from a scientific point, you need funding, you need data, you need drilling, you need a lot of things that cannot be done like that. But then, in most countries, politics really runs on a 4 or 5 year cycle. Different kind of time frames. The law and the management, if you want to do things well, you cannot say, I'm going to have a plan for 4 weeks, 2 months, 6 months, 4 years. Actually, when you think of the global, the Sustainable Development Goals, 2030, or other things, it's always long-term. Frustrating, but long-term. And when it's really long, the trick is to have intermediate steps, intermediate monitoring, and progress. But again, you may have the best law in the world. Finally, you spent so many years, you got the science right, you have the legal instruments, and so on. If there's no implementation, if there's no political will, you'll not go anywhere. And actually, often, as happened in the Guarani Aquifer region, you may have to start from science again. If politicians change in Buenos Aires, and new politicians arrive, they have no idea what an aquifer is, because let's face it, it's complex. And they're asked to implement the Guarani Aquifer Agreement, which I thought had entered into force, but actually has not entered into force. Somebody will have to go and train the policymakers and explain to them that if you dig a borehole in Sao Paulo, it won't flood Buenos Aires in a matter of hours. So I'll leave it to that, and I'm happy to take questions afterwards. Thank you very much.
Now, I don't have to go into basics again. So I will start right away by trying to share with you a little bit of my experience with working on transboundary water resources that includes aquifers. In my perspective, the basins, all of them, are built on both groundwater and surface water. And of course, they start with hydrology. And even in the UN Convention of 1997, it actually says very vividly that whenever we are talking about the basin, we are talking both on surface water and groundwater. And in a way, everything that is there concerning surface water is right on the aquifers. Of course, the aquifers gives us challenges of completely different things in terms of uncertainties, in terms of understanding what and where they are. If we don't see it with our own eyes, it's always much more difficult. But I want to take you to a completely different field. And the starting point is different. The starting point is water diplomacy. This is where I come from. And water diplomacy is a process addressing the political and social aspect that hinder or enable cooperation on water resources that are shared between states. Of course, it is within a very complex things of different issues. But the idea is that we all know the tension between sovereignty and interdependency that makes the whole exercise very, very complicated. And what we would like to do is we would like, in the long term and in the short term, to create such a cooperation between countries, because at the end of the day, we have learned that when we cooperate, we gain much more. And the water resource is being managed in a much more sustainable way. So what I'm going to tell you actually is things that you know. If you're looking at this is a most recent work on trying to identify basins at risk. Now, basins at risk are those basins in which you might find more conflictual tendencies than you find cooperative tendencies. And in order to try and identify such basins, which is in the very core of what I'm doing, there is a complex of issues that goes in, from national power to governance to economic to population stress to yearly precipitation, etc., etc., etc. From hydrological side to the socio-economic side, and of course, when we put those elements together, the complexity is huge. So we have identified basins. We are doing that for the last 25 years already. And the initial work of Aaron Wolf, that I'm sure many of you know, and if not, I will be happy to talk to you about it, actually put the list of factors which will help us to see which basins are at risk. And this, for water diplomacy, is a very important tool, because then we know in which basins we have to invest more time, more resources. The State Department is using that, and as you can see out of them, you will not be surprised to see many of those that you know already from the Ganges, Brahmaputra, but I enlarged the Jordan Basin because I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Jordan River. So this is how I got to it. I had never touched water besides drinking and washing my hands. And then in 1995, Shimon Peres, who was then the Minister of Foreign Affairs, called me in and said, Ram, we are going in our area, in the Jordan Basin, we are involved in the Madrid peace process, in which water will have a major play to play. So come in and bring your abilities in the diplomacy side. And I jumped into the room, and around me were lawyers, because in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, water was dealt with by the legal department. After my time it changed, by the way. I'm sorry to tell you. I took the water out of the lawyers as a leading force. And I add in, I saw the hydrologists, I saw the engineers, I saw everyone, and a diplomat coming into the room was a bit strange for them. We have learned to work together, and I was the head of the Israel negotiating team within the multilateral peace process for 5 years, and since then I'm dealing with water in different ways. So let's jump in, because what I want to tell you is in the story. A few words about the Jordan Basin. I'm sure most of you have heard about. It's holy for all three religions, monotheistic religions. It is situated in the Middle East. It has 5 riparian parties, and I'm not saying states, I say parties, because the Palestinians, unfortunately, until now, do not have their own recognized states. There is the Palestinian Authority, but no state, unfortunately. So we have Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Israel, and the Palestinian Authority. You see them all over here. For those of you, Lebanon is right here. These are the origins of the Jordan River. And then we have Syria and the Golan Heights over here. Then Jordan right here with the long border between Israel and Jordan and the Palestinian Authority, between the Sea of Galilee over here and the Dead Sea over here. And the Palestinian authorities, this is the West Bank, and this is Gaza, which is less connected to that. And you know that these are rough days. Even nowadays, there are exchange of files between Israel and the Palestinians in Gaza. I believe it. Now, this river used to be, as many other rivers, at the beginning of the 20th century, with about 1.3 billion cubic meters. It may not sound a big quantity for you, especially those who come from Latin America, but in our region, it's a very important one. And what happened is exactly what Francesco talked about. Drop population in about 50 years, almost 10 times falls in all 3 countries, Jordan, Israel, Syria, and a little bit in Lebanon. And of course, the water goes, as you know, a little bit for drinking purposes. You know that only about 8% of the water going for domestic needs, and most of the water in the world are being used for irrigation. Now, what happened is, with this population growth, which is legitimate, is that both Syria, Israel, and Jordan just divert water out of the river, each of them around 300 million cubic meter, and you multiply it very easy. 300 million multiplied by 3, a little bit more, you got less. You add in the climate change, you add in other factors which are regional, and this is the a dwindled river, less than 10% of the original flow, contaminated, and this is what I'm doing in the last 10 years. I'm working very intensely as an advisor for the rehabilitation of the Jordan River. But this has other effects. For example, the Dead Sea level is going down at about 1 meter per year. This is a dying lake, and we are thinking of how to do that. And you see that even though there is a great deficit. So what is the Jordan Basin? The Jordan Basin is no water. Deficit this is Jordan, one of the lower countries in the world in terms of needs of water. There is already that, and if I'm going to the region, we are talking about billions of dollars which are needed. Now, the hydropolitics of this is even more, you start being complicated. And I will not go again into that, but it speaks for itself. You have, in between 3 of the major countries, there is war. Between Israel and Syria, between Israel and Lebanon, there is a state of war. Between Israel and Jordan, which is the case that I'm talking about, there is peaceful relations, more or less. There is a formal relations, but I will show you what it is. The Palestinian Authority has some sort of an agreement with Jordan about water, of course, no political thing. So you can see that it is very difficult to talk about it as the ideal way in which we would like to have an agreement on the whole basin, where it is a multilateral one. So all the agreements that we have here are bilateral and not multilateral. Let me give you a story of 2 aquifers in our region. One is between us and the Palestinians, and one is between between Israel and Jordan. Palestinian Authority, a very complicated situation, an agreement in 95, an interim agreement, and you can see that over the West Bank, all the green areas are actually in between Israel, the responsibility on them are in between Israel and the Palestinians, and the Palestinians areas that are completely in their hands are those that are small brown one. You hardly see them because this is the case. And all the rest is the civil responsibility is in Israel. However, all this area, which is the West Bank, it's not very big, by the way. It's about 150 kilometers this way and 60 kilometers that way. Don't think in terms of Texas. This particular area is actually shattered into pieces in terms of responsibility between the different parties. However, in between Israel and Jordan, we have an aquifer, which is called the mountain aquifer, a potential of around 400 to 450 million cubic meters per year, and it has a very interesting position. It is recharged mostly over Palestinian area, and it's yes, that's the right way, and its confining area is under Israel. So right away, you would put all the different factors that you see in the Water Convention, you ask yourself, okay, so who has the rights here? Those that are contributing to the water, that their political position is, as I showed you, is shattered? Is it the Israeli side because it did all that is one aquifer and it doesn't matter actually where the water are charged in or where they are confined and where. So anyway, this is a very important source of water both for Israel and for the Palestinians. And certainly the issue between them when they are coming to negotiate is what is allocation and what is how to allocate and how to manage it together. Now, I bring you right away to the most difficult thing, and that is dealing with ethos. What this means for them. Now, for the Palestinians, it's a symbol of our sovereignty. If we manage, it means we have some sovereignty. And it goes hand in hand. Will I have the sovereignty first, or will I reach the sovereignty through being understood that I'm managing it? We need to be recognized for our water rights, and we have future needs. We are thinking of the refugees coming back. We don't. So the Israelis, on the other side, have other efforts. For example, they say, we don't trust the Palestinians. If they will run this aquifer, they will ruin it. We saw their inabilities in many other cases. And we are interdependent on that. We develop the sources. We know how to do it. We have the better science. We have the better measurement. We are dealing with this aquifer seriously for many years. And guys, the aquifer is fully utilized, which means that whatever future needs you are talking about means hurting others. So this is how we get into the negotiation in 1995. We had different agreements with the Palestinians on the way. In 1995, an interim agreement for 5 years. What it says concerning water, there is an article about water, very interesting. The first is the recognition of Palestinians' water rights. Indeed, it starts with the following. Israel recognizes the water rights of the Palestinians in the West Bank. Full stop. Good? Nice? Nice, but only nice. No substance, guys. Because when it comes to water rights, at the end of the day, it's a matter of understanding between the parties concerned. There is nowhere in the world that somebody can say, I have a water right, besides human rights. Okay, and even there is a doubt about the quantity. But if you leave aside the human rights issue, There's nowhere in the world. But Israel said it. Palestinians insisted, and we said, yes, we recognize your water rights. The second was quantity, allocation, and management. Yes, it says the Palestinians will get that much, and the Israelis will get that much, and in terms of management, there will be a joint water committee between them in order to do it. There's also a definition of the future needs of the Palestinians, 60, 70 million cubic. And it all will come from one part of the aquifer that Israel is in operation, on the eastern side. So, on the face of it, it sounds good. But as we said about the recognition is it's a slogan. When it comes to management and the Joint Water Committee, remember that Israelis are still the sovereign and the control over this area. So whatever has been agreed between the parties goes to them. 5 minutes. Okay, and the Joint Water Committee. So, in any case, what should have been agreed upon 5 years later ended up with Camp David, no permanent agreement, and afterwards the Second Intifada, actually war between Israel and the Palestinians, and in the meantime there are daily needs, and you just look at the blue and the red, the blue supplies by Israel, the red supplies by the Palestinians, and you can see that the interdependency between them is important. Now let me say a few words about another aquifer that we are talking about. This is Israel-Jordan, where the interests are completely different. We are sharing 3 elements that I want you to look at. One is the Yarmuk River, the major contributor to the lower Jordan River, the Jordan River, and Wadi Araba aquifer down there. Now, Israel and Jordan signed the peace treaty. You know who are those in the photo here? You don't. 2 great people, unfortunately not with us. On the left-hand side is King Hussein of Jordan, who died about 15 years ago, a great person. I met him a couple of times, a noble man in the good sense. On the left-hand side is Prime Minister Rabin, who was murdered on November 4th, 1995 by a right-wing military. They are standing here over the Sea of Galilee, talking about what kind of peace treaty, and indeed, we signed a peace agreement with a water agreement in order to solve all the water problems between the countries. We said something about water rights, but how we said it? We first agreed practically who takes what, and then we called it rightful allocation. So you can hear a little bit the echo of rights in terms, but we went the other way around. We were not looking at what are the rights, but first we allocate and then we give the rightful allocation. And of course, the other principle that Francesco said, no significant harm to work together. And in this agreement, there are different things that I would love to tell you about, but unfortunately we don't have time. Yes, we have a Joint Water Committee, but it works nicely because they are sovereign between them. There is an allocation between them, which is talking about south and north. Let me say a word about it because it is important. The Araba aquifer is right over here. Amman is the main place of need by Jordanians for water, which is up north, and there is a conduit of water that takes water from the Sea of Galilee down over here to Adassia and goes out to Amman. So the idea is the following: how we can use Israelis' presence in the south in order to help the Palestinians up north. And there are 2 ways to do it. First one, in the allocation agreement. Look what they say. They say there are wells. They actually mark the border during the agreement. And so it happened, there were a few wells which were on the Jordanian side. Now this is an example of cooperation, that even if the wells are on the Jordanian side, as if nothing to do with Israel, because there is a will, the Jordanians said, okay, you can keep on using those wells. Now the agreement is for 25 years. So at the same time, Israel is supplying the same quantity of water up north. We find a way that if you wish to do it, you look for the practical way. So one way is saying, even if I'm a sovereign, but I want to give in order to give back in a different place, I will do it. So up north, we gave 10 million, and the second way has to do with technology. Since 2006, Israel is desalinating seawater as a strategic source. Actually, we are doing between 60 to 70% of our domestic needs from desalinated water. That helps us a lot with our relations with our neighbors. And what we did with the Jordanians is looking for ways how to use desalination in order to help us. And again, we are in the midst of a process in which we will build together with the Jordanians a desalination plant down at the Red Sea, the only place where Jordanians have access to the sea. And in return, Israel will buy the water from the Red Sea, desalinated Red Sea, to be used in the south of the country, and will supply the same quantity of water in the same price up north. So, in order to conclude, what are the major issues that I can see that were missing? One is the overall strategic political interest of the countries. If it is there, if it is something that we can develop, and this is what I do, I actually convince countries that it is important and it is within their interest to cooperate. But if the strategic political works, and Israel has interest in Jordan, and Jordan has interest in Israel, then you can find solutions. If it is like the issue of the Palestinians, unfortunately the cooperation is not there. The balance of power, the hegemony at the basin has a lot to do with it. And no other way but to see if the hegemon is playing a role of a bully or he is playing a role of a leader. And the examples are that around the world. These are, of course, not my word. Mark Zetoun, working at East Anglia University, did lots of work about power and hegemony, and I think that this is very important. The third issue is technology. Technology and your imagination can take you of how technology can help as a game changer. I gave one technology, and that's the technology of desalination, but you can think how many uncertainties can be reduced once you do it. How you can verify agreement, how you can build agreements that are actually more resilient to changes, either it is climate change or anything else. So, by this, I will put a full stop, and I will be happy to answer.
All right, so first of all, for all you thinking about the relevance of these points and these comments, let me just point to our own backyard, U.S.-Mexico border. Some work that we've been doing, we believe that there's around 36 transboundary aquifers on the border. We're still not sure about how many, but we think there's 36. There's no agreement except on one of these aquifers. There's an agreement not to pump, not to pump, but just to not pump. And the other ones have no other real agreement. Another one has some data sharing arrangements, but that's it. And so this is very relevant, I think, to what's happening here on the U.S.-Mexico border, and also in relation to how you all, as lawyers that may be representing individuals, companies, landowners, water rights holders, and so on the border region, might have to think about how to deal with the other side of the border, given the fact that we don't have an agreement here with Mexico on the broader border. So this is something that I think is actually really very relevant. Also keep in mind that in Texas, we have the rule of capture, which I want to bring up in a little bit, whereas Arizona and New Mexico and California have completely different regimes, not the same. And in Mexico, we have a centralized public ownership of water, which is, again, a very different regime. And so, how does law and politics and diplomacy enter into all this? So this is some of the stuff that I want to try to talk about or get into. So let me start off to both of you, but this is a comment that I think that's something that Francesco brought up earlier, and I want to. You pointed out the fact that there's so few agreements over transboundary aquifers around the world. With 592 aquifers that are transboundary, and we have 5 or 6, depending how you count, maybe 7 transboundary agreements. For rivers and lakes, I can tell you there's between 270 to 300 transboundary rivers and lakes, depending how you count, and there's over 3,600 treaties for navigation, for non-navigational uses, and so on. So the comparison is, it's pretty stark. But the fact that we don't have any agreements, does that mean we don't need them? Does that mean that the countries have decided maybe we don't need agreements over transboundary aquifers, or is there some other reason that there are so few?
Guys, now?
As you wish.
I think that the reasons are the following. One, I feel that many of the issues were covered in the overall treaties on transboundary water resources. The basins are included. Actually, the number of 592, I think we refer to around 300 transboundary water basins. So it is covering many of those things. 2 aquifers were not in the very center of the country's needs. People did agreements where it is needed, and surface water was there and sure. However, I think that agreements are of major importance because it is proved that in basins where you have agreements, even if the agreements are not good, it helps, I would say, reduce the risk of conflictual relations, even if the agreement is not good. So we are looking at agreements, which of them has the resilience to stand in different changes, in order to make sure that the institution is built in a solid way that even if tomorrow we have less water, it's still there will be an institution that helps. But there is no question that in places where you have agreement, there are less conflict, or the conflicts are being solved in a better way rather than escalate.
So let me give you my 2 answers. 1, you don't have agreements because you don't even know you have an aquifer in the first place, first. And 2, and this goes much more along the lines just said, for a lot of countries, you either already have an agreement on transboundary surface water, or there's just a lack of resources, and hence you just stick to what you already have. So the first one is, the 592, the number, comes from a map that an organization in the Netherlands have developed, IGRAC, International Groundwater Assessment Center. And it's interesting, if you look at these maps from 2003, I think was the first one, to 2009, then 2012, 15, the maps change. And, I'm not a hydrogeologist, so I was very puzzled by these maps. Because in the first one, the aquifers were magic circles. And I said to myself, this is amazing what's happening underground, how these incredible circle transboundary aquifers. Obviously then I was told the truth of what was happening. And there was a circle just because the two countries responded to a request of information from, I'll call it the UN, and they said, yes, we have a transboundary aquifer. And then the second question, do you know something about it? Not really. And in some cases, they didn't even want to share the information. So the point I'm trying to make is that in many cases, we don't have an agreement. Because as much as there's a sense that there is an aquifer, the knowledge of it is still very rudimentary. Now, the point we're trying to make, or I'm trying to make, is that actually that's the reason to have an agreement in the first place. You want to build that data. You want to exchange that data. Now, the other thing, as you said, if you already have a legal instrument, maybe even an institution, maybe even funding towards the management of a transboundary surface water body, international water course, why bother? Some countries or some people may just say, just add a few bits and pieces and you include the transboundary aquifer. Now, from a cost-effective perspective, I see it, but what I think is that any country wanting to do something like that has to be very careful to have the necessary trained people in that specific institution which was developed to deal with transboundary surface water management, and that can also capture the specific nuances that transboundary aquifer and groundwater has. Because yes, as you said, often it's the very same basin, the two interact, but sometimes it does present some very specific challenges. And you have that aspect there.
I want to give just one example of the importance of having the right data. We agreed with the Palestinians that their future needs, about 60 to 70 million cubic meters per year, will come from the development of a certain aquifer. It's called the Israel aquifer. Apparently, we have learned during the first 5 years that whatever numbers we had on the potential of water in this aquifer were all imaginative. And not only that we don't have the 60, 70, but whichever, even a very deep well was dug in, did not find what was expected to be found. And now we know better the hydrology, we know the formation of the layers, etc. But certainly the uncertainties when it comes to aquifer are much more important than it is to the surface water.
So, in terms of countries that have a portion of an aquifer underneath their territory, or if it's not a country, if it's a territory, if it's something that's not quite a country like the Palestinian Authority, and you mentioned in your presentation, at the point you wanted to skip over sovereignty. I was wondering to what extent a country can say, hey, this is under my territory, therefore I should have 100% right to everything underneath. Because the sovereignty provision you referenced, that's essentially what it's saying. But I'm wondering if this is sort of the same what you were trying to do in that treaty or that agreement with the Palestinians, or something different. So, I mean, how does sovereignty fit in here in terms of the country owning or the authority owning, and or if this is something less than ownership?
Well, we know that this interdependency and sovereignty, we are not far away from the place where the Harmon Doctrine was actually instituted, that said that whatever you have in your territory, you have the full sovereignty to do it. And every international thing has to do with giving up part of your sovereignty. There is no question about it. The thing is that when you add this to the uncertainty that we have concerning the hydrology of the aquifer, then it is much more difficult to see one's portion, one's ability. And I think Francesco gave a wonderful example when he said we started with one aquifer and we ended up with two. So the issue of dealing with it is there, of course. Otherwise, I see the UN Convention and the principles of bringing into practice the interdependency of the country. Usually I give this very simple example. You have a bucket, and each of us have a straw in our mouth, and if we are drinking, if one drinks, then the other doesn't. So you need to have the balance of the power of who can drink and how much he can drink. And even if the quantity of water is huge, like the issue of the DC between Jordan and Saudi Arabia, that each of them can take hundreds of millions, actually billions, when it comes to Saudi Arabia. But it is understood that at a certain moment, if one zips more, the other zip less. So countries have to think of how to do it in a sustainable way. Remember that at the end of the day, the cooperation is aiming at one thing, a more, I would say, efficient use of the water resource, and the second, to do it as much as possible in a sustainable way. Otherwise, also have an empty bucket.
So first of all, please do not use straws. Straws are bad. Plastic is bad. So leaving that aside, let me just give you, some of you may know, but just if you want the normative context to this debate on sovereignty. So the Watercourses Convention, this normative framework for rivers, transboundary rivers, let's call them like that. There is no such thing as a provision that states sovereignty over a portion of the river. And it goes immediately to equitable and reasonable utilization, no harm. The draft articles on the law of transboundary aquifer does have a provision, Article 3, that reads, if I remember correctly, something along the lines of each aquifer state will have sovereignty over the portion of its aquifer, full stop, and it continues. It will do so in accordance with general principles of international law, or with international law, and in accordance with the rest of the draft articles. So I'm highlighting this because when this provision entered the draft articles, it started a fireworks of both people and some countries saying, this is a disgrace. How can we go back to the Harman Doctrine? Well, this literally means that if you want to use straws, you'll just use a straw and soak it out, soak it dry, and that you can literally do whatever you want on your side of the border and destroy the aquifer, which, by the way, you're destroying it also for you, but that's another issue. And I disagree. I think that what we have here is potentially not the most elegant or best legally drafted provision in the world, welcome to international law, and a compromise. Compromise between, one, the hydrological formation itself, the rock and the groundwater. So nobody will tell you that there's no sovereignty on the rock of the aquifer, despite the fact you could say there's an ecosystem that relates the rock and the liquid and so forth and so forth. And the sovereignty is a limited sovereignty on the liquid. All the rest of the draft articles, all general principles of international law in 2019 guide you to say that there's no such thing as absolute sovereignty on the groundwater in a transboundary aquifer. Now, if you want to interpret it like that, then it's a political decision, not a legal decision, a political decision. So, to wrap up, I think, yes, there is a tension there. It's a tension that can, I wouldn't say easily, but can be dealt with through interpretation, through legal interpretation. And hence, to me, it's probably a bigger issue than what it actually is.
All right. You mentioned earlier when you referenced the UN Watercourses Convention, and I was starting to think in terms of how it applies and the terms that it uses. Because you said that it encompasses the whole basin, and there's a concept of what exactly is a watercourse, a system of surface and groundwater. There's a definition for it. But you also mentioned terms, water rights, in the Jordanian-Israeli agreement, there's rightful allocation, or is it for the Palestinians? There's also some other terms and so on. And you mentioned human right to water, equitable, reasonable utilization. I mean, to what extent are all these terms important to achieve the agreement? Do we need these terms to be enshrined in the law and say, here countries, these are the terms that the rules are supposed to abide by? Or is it something that the countries are supposed to come up with their own terms? Because that's what it sounds like happened with Israel, as opposed to looking to the international law that already has these terms.
Well, I think it starts with the goodwill. There it starts and there it finishes. Huh?
And it finishes there.
Yes, there it starts and there it ends. If there is a political will, you can find different ways. In my experience, the last 30 years, I never saw an agreement in which countries were imposed to behave according to the UN Convention. However, since the UN Convention was, to begin with, established on the practice and the experience of countries, because this convention actually was built the other way around. It was not somebody who thought what is the ideal, but they went along to see how countries behave. Starting with 1966, the International Law Association, the Helsinki Rules, and in between them. So it is a collective wisdom of practical behavior, managed together with the ability of countries to grasp something that is written black on white. It is not, and you have to remember that, it is not by chance that it took from up until 1966, nothing was there on the international in terms of writing down what are the rules. And it took from 66 to 97 to put it in a UN non-binding resolution, right? 66 to 97. And it took from 97 to 2014 in order to be ratified and actually come into force, not ratified, but come into force. And even after coming into force, it is only, I think, 36 countries, if I'm not mistaken, and many of them are actually not involved in their own which means that looking at the convention and the international law as the source of determination would be, to my mind, a little bit inspiring rather than the fact. However, it is true that there is a nice and good thing that people can live with. And if you wish, from time to time, they will refer to it, as we did with rightful allocation, where we give the people the feeling that we are looking into the practice of the international law. But it starts the other way around. And whenever you start with this, you get nowhere.
Just very briefly, I think the terminology, let's say the definition, it varies very much if we're thinking of a legal instrument that has as a goal to provide guidelines at a global level, or if we're talking about an ad hoc legal instrument that aims to manage a specific transboundary river or a specific transboundary aquifer. If we're talking about global instruments, well, the terminology will have been developed over years, and it's what it is, and it's usually understood. And as I said before, I mean, it doesn't mean that equitable reasonable utilization means this. It's just the term that has been used, or joint authorities and so forth. Now, when it comes to the actual ad hoc agreement, then it's up to the parties. It's up to the parties, and this will very much depend also on cultural circumstances, on social, even religious circumstances in some parts. The joint authority may be called in a particular way. The specific aspect of indigenous people rights, that will not happen in one country, it will happen in another set of countries. So I think it doesn't determine the success or not of an agreement.
So let me ask one last question, and we'll open it up. So if you were asked to give advice to the United States about potential relationship with one of its neighbors or both of its neighbors on transboundary water resources, based on your experience, what would you tell them?
This is not climate change.
I think that you can see right away the difference between the way the U.S. is running its relations with Canada and the way the U.S. is running its relations with Mexico on those issues. I think I don't have to go further than that in order to tell that there is a difference. And the difference is connected to power, to hegemony, to interdependency, to legitimacy of relations, to investment by both countries. You cannot compare, unfortunately, what happens in Mexicali, which is, even in the last month, it's a disgrace, I would say. Colorado is in such a bad shape. Actually, there's no Colorado. South of the border, there is no Colorado. To what is happening at the Big Lakes, where lots of resources are being invested also by Canada. So life speaks.
So if the question is, what would be your legal advice to the federal government, I would just leave it. No, I really wouldn't know. I would actually say, if I were to give, if you were to say, Francesco, who would you focus your legal advice on in order to hopefully make much more of an impact? That's a different question. I would say I would skip the federal government, and I would identify those communities who have more of a stake when it comes to transboundary water resources. Then obviously you would need to help me, so we've had to create a team, because obviously my knowledge of US politics and, well, constitutional, let's say, law is limited. But the point I'm trying to make, and it's the example, in a way, also of the Ocotepeque-Citalá or some pilot projects in Latin America, Salto Concordia, I would skip the central government. I would go to the local authorities, to the municipalities, to the water authorities. So I think that's more or less what happened in El Paso, to some extent. So that's what I would do. I would, if the legal framework of the US and Mexico allows it, which I know Mexico is more centralized, so that could be an issue. But where it is possible, I would go to, and in particular, especially on the Mexico side and the Texas side or US, I would try to really work with the vulnerable communities, with those communities who really are having less water, do not have the money to pay for the water, or having sanitation issues and so forth. The exact contours of the legal advice, I would need to stay here a longer time.
All right. Any questions? Yeah.
Hi. Thank you so much for both of your presentations. My area of research is transboundary hydrocarbons. So I can see these are a lot of parallel stories from what you're talking about here from the oil and gas point of view. But there is one actor in oil and gas that has actually pushed and forced the governments to sign agreements when it comes to transboundary fields. And it's always the private sector. And I was wondering why, in your story, big pharma, the big farmers or the big industrial farmers are not part of the story. When you mentioned, I will talk to the communities that are vulnerable, you never mentioned, I will talk to the guys that actually are using the water for industrial purposes that can actually have even more leverage on local authorities or even the federal government. These are the actors that usually, when it comes to hydrocarbons, they always tell the governments, I'm not going to invest a penny here unless you sign a treaty with your neighbor. Because the stakes are so high for me in terms of investment that I don't know. So I was wondering why, when it comes to water, always the private sector is not as strong, at least in the narrative from both sides. Not as strong.
So I'm looking at the Guarani. So the Guarani is a huge transboundary aquifer between Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, and Paraguay. Brazil is the hegemon there, power. Most of the aquifer is in Brazil, and most of the water resources are used by Brazil. There's a huge agro-business, agro-industry, you'd say. So you could say, well, in Brazil, the key player should be that sector there. I, like you, think that private sector should play a role. There was a huge World Bank, I think you were involved as well, the World Bank FAO project on groundwater governance. And only once the big private sector was invited. And I thought that was too little. Too little, too late. Having said that, I do think the same reason why the normative guidelines for transboundary aquifers, groundwater, has been separated from transboundary oil and gas. Because in 2003, when the United Nations, when the United International Commission started the work, it was transboundary oil, gas, and groundwater. With the idea, let's see, a bit like you said, let's see in the past, you know, joint utilization and all sort of legal landscape for oil and gas, and let's couple it with groundwater, and maybe we can find some good practice. 1 year afterwards, the Jose Yamada, the Japanese ambassador, said, no, let's start with groundwater, and then we'll move on to oil and gas. And what happened, and there were, in a way, the rationale for that was based on the nature of the natural resource. Water is not like oil and gas. It's just different. And interestingly, then, when the work at the multilateral level finished on the groundwater, oil and gas was brought back in. And it lasted a year and a half, maybe. It disappeared. Now we can speculate on why. You can read the minutes and everything. In writing it says, we do not need normative guidelines on transboundary oil and gas because what we have works. That is rubbish. If it works, write them down. Clearly there was lobbying that they didn't want these. So I'm rambling around. I mean, I do see the point. Let's get the mega farmers or the oil and gas industry that needs water or whatever to push even DC to have an agreement with Mexico. But then that will be an agreement tailored to the lobby interest of the private sector. If I'm asked the legal advice, I'll first want to understand what the vulnerable communities want, not the super duper lobby oil and gas, which has its role, absolutely, and most likely will have a much more powerful role in DC than the vulnerable communities. But if it's me that is being asked, you know, I would first go to the vulnerable communities. And then if I can buy in the private sector, great. But I wouldn't start by the private sector. And I may fail. I know that.
I think the answer is very simple. There's no money there. Simply as that. As water is low politics, when it comes to water and money, then the money is in the big engineering project that comes from governments. Actually, I had a deep experience in trying to involve the private sector in transboundary issues of water, and I completely failed. The guys do not want to put their hands into anything that runs with political issues. What will they say? Can they say something that is different than their government? No. If you take let's take a practical thing. You know that the most difficult hotspots when it comes to transboundary is on the Nile, on the Blue Nile, in between Ethiopia and Egypt. This is now the most vulnerable place because of the Ethiopian building the Grand Renaissance Dam of Ethiopia. The money which comes over there, the World Bank did not want to participate because there is no agreement between the Mediterranean countries. The government of Italy came in, and that is why it's an Italian company that is building it. And they play no role whatsoever in maybe a little bit a bad role by putting some economic sanctions on the Ethiopian government to start filling the dam between Sudan, Egypt. The private sector is involved a little bit with a few initiatives. There are a few initiatives in the world to do that, but when it comes to transboundary, they are not there. They're simply not there because they don't want to dare their hands in something that they do not understand.
I guess also, I mean, and you will know better than us from the private sector, the risk of being involved is too high.
Other questions? Yeah.
The examples you all focus on, there seem to be kind of two paradigms by which countries may arrive at such water agreements. So in the case of Israel and Jordan, the agreement was between one hegemon and another, between two great noble leaders, Prime Minister Abiy and Hussein, and the agreement has been remarkably successful. And in the very promising memorandum of understanding between El Salvador and Honduras, that agreement seems to have been, perhaps government-led, a more system-wide interaction involving a plethora of actors, and so that's perhaps another paradigm by which agreements on water may be reached on the one hand between two great strong leaders, and on the other hand between two systems involving great plurality of actors. I'm just curious if characterize those examples correctly, and are those indeed two viable paradigms by which agreements on water may be reached?
I think it has to go both ways, up, down, and down, up. There's no other way, because if it is only on the top echelon and you don't have the support of the communities involved and other stakeholders, then it simply won't hold water. And local communities have some power, but it depends on their ability to change the overall view. There are a few great stories even between the US and Canada on Devil's Lake. I know it's a great story. I don't have time to tell you, but Canada and the US were fighting over a drainage system from Devil's Lake because it was connected to the Red River and to the Red River to the Hudson. And the fight began between North Dakota and Manitoba. And they could not reach an agreement until the White House and the central government in Ottawa sat down together to solve the issue. It took 6 years, don't think. But you need both things. You cannot have one.
So, in relation to Cotopeques-Itala, let me just add a few things. One, the Jordan River and all the story, for what I understood also from you, is a good story, a success story. The Cotopeques-Itala is 1 month old. Who knows if it's a good practice or not? And also, if your question is, could these be frameworks that could be applicable elsewhere, I would put a huge word of caution there. Everything is so contextualized that what works in that specific region of El Salvador and Honduras may not even work in other regions of El Salvador and Honduras. And let me also raise another thing. So this Greta project had 3 case studies. One in Central America, one in Southern Africa on the Stampede between South Africa, Namibia, Botswana, and one in the Pretashkan in Central Asia. Of those 3, 2 have led, including the Cotopeques-Itala, to some sort of instrument. The fact that the Cotopeques-Itala has an instrument, is it because the people of El Salvador and Honduras really wanted it? or is it because of development cooperation funded by Switzerland? I like to think that at some point, the population and the local municipalities and the people of El Salvador and Honduras would have realized that the groundwater was precious and they needed it and so forth, and they would have come to cooperation. The reality is that a lot of these very few agreements around the world are pushed, encouraged, and it's a good thing, but it also raises questions from development cooperation agendas. Now, this may not ring bells here in the US, obviously, but in those parts of the world that have the strongest water stress problem, the direst problem of water, it's very much agendas, positive agendas, but still agendas developed by the North. And that is something that, there's not an easy answer. Again, it's a complex matter. But it is something, both in Stamprit and the Cotopeque Citara, I remember going there and giving a training in a room like this about law of transboundary aquifers. To be honest, most of them, seriously? We have crime, we have immigration, or emigration, and we have this and that. This is not relevant. A bit what you were saying about groundwater. And it's only actually when we started talking about the links between groundwater and sustainable development, the sustainable development goals, groundwater and the Paris Agreement, and climate change, that actually some people in the room say, ooh, I want to hear about this. So it's also strategic almost, how do you bring that attention, but then are you almost imposing an instrument on them? It's complex.
Other questions? Yeah.
Would love to try. If you get one chance to talk to you guys, thank you for being here for one. In my line of work, studying environmental law in context of actually studying in Professor Extension class, studying transboundary water, but also other issues. And 4 years later, here we are, and kind of trying to bring to the table here a little bit of international collaboration from a framework, right? And also looking at the futility of the law and talking ourselves in a circle. Law is inherently reactive. We're talking about problems that have a need to react to, and we're also trying to be lawyers in a room to foresee a long-term solution that is just outside the nature of the law. So we write agreements, right? We get creative, we do that well. When I was coming here today, I pulled over from Dallas, and I was looking at what would I bring up from an international law context that might be able to ask you guys something to read, spot a pattern to where in the law is it being effective. And I came to also the equitable and reasonable utilization as an inherent, is the leading mechanism in international law. But I guess my feedback that I'm asking to maybe just your opinion on is it not inherently futile before data is valued above financial resources? Is it not possible that the fact that we're looking at equity between private actors, governments, and stakeholders at all levels, until that's an equal, definition in law, is it not impossible to actually reach an equitable agreement and therefore to keep running in a vicious cycle of the law, science, reaction inside of the political regime where you're going to, by the nature of equity, you have a winner and a loser. And if data isn't involved in that and met in the middle, how can we proceed?
If I understood you correctly,
So I'm trying to get a law.
I'm not sure 100%. My masters who taught me in practice what to do, they always started with hydrology and data. If you don't know what is going on, you cannot move. And when we prepared ourselves to the negotiations, we did a tremendous work of trying to gather as much data as possible. This was the starting point, because if you don't know as much as you can, including scenarios of future needs, including scenarios of what will happen, including scenarios of how can you make sure that what you are afraid of will not happen, and think of it in the widest in terms of land uses, for example, because land uses, when it comes to aquifer, has tremendous importance. Will you have just cows over there? Will you have house sheds over there, when you have industry. So land uses are very important. And when you come to deal with water and you come to deal with a future agreement, you have to think of it. Now, secondly, is the order inside each of the parties, of course, where you refer to the relations to the private sector, etc. So if you ask me, when I go to a new place, this is the order that I'm doing. First, I would like to understand the hydrology, the physics, but also in the future, and then look into the way things are molded in each of the parties, in order also to identify stakeholders, because it's a multilateral negotiations at the end of the day, and you want to know who to talk to in order to get something that will be sustainable and will be kept. And only then you start thinking of how to create a cooperation. And at the end comes the lawyers who would put it in a way and the language that would make it. Now, many lawyers that I know are participating in all these 4 stages. Okay? But I hope
Let me, so first of all, thanks for coming from Dallas. We now understand it's not really the doorstep, it's quite far away, at least from a European perspective. So you say law is reactive. Often, yes, but the example I'm going to bring is, in my opinion, a good practice precisely because it wasn't reactive. And it's the Guarani Aquifer Agreement. By no means the most beautiful, perfect, there's no such thing as a perfect treaty or anything. But this was negotiated first in 2005, then it's cold, and then back in 2010, when there really wasn't any water big stress problem in the region. So it's not a reactive legal instrument. It actually was a preventative legal instrument. So in that sense, yes, often you have, an oil spill, nuclear accident, and then you do the law. But sometimes it's not like that. The other thing of the Guarani, it's interesting, the story that led to the agreement, because in 2003, there had been studies before 2003, very sporadic, ad hoc, from universities in particular, that had developed not data, but also relationships between people. And this is where I'm going with this. In 2003, a big global environmental facility, World Bank project implemented by the Organization of American States, co-funded by the 4 countries, that lasted between 2003 and 2009, strengthened both the data, but also those relationships. So what happened was that in 2009, you had a really strong group of Uruguayans, Paraguayans, Brazilians, and Argentinians working on hydrogeology, involved in hydrogeology, who talked the same language, and who started actually having, because it's a small world, also connections in politics. And I wouldn't say that was what made the Guarani Aquifer Agreement, but it definitely helped. And their frustration, still is that there wasn't a follow-up to the project, hence there was no more money. So that those people who had been gathering, say, 3 times a year, just couldn't gather anymore. What we think in Europe or North America, come on, how much does it cost to get hydrogeologists around the US? Well, probably peanuts in the bigger issue. In other parts of the world, this is really complicated. And this is what these projects actually are able to do, get people in the room. So it's not just about data, it's about people. And building that connections, that relationships. And let's be honest, often it's not just about the relations in this room, it's the dinners, it's the coffees in the morning. Those things are almost more important, to be honest. So those are the kind of things that help then also to build political trust and the diplomacy and support.
All right, I think we're going to be running out of time, so what we can have, we're going to have a reception here afterwards for a little while, so you guys are certainly welcome to come up and ask our guests further questions, but I want to please join me in thanking both of our guests, Aviram and Francesco Sindico, for coming all this way and sharing their experience with us. So thank you very much, both of you.